Thanks, Warren, and lovely to be here. It's our first trip out of Australia in 3 years, so it was fantastic to get on our carbon offset flight. Come 30 hours. Thank you for having your borders open. It was actually at times easier to get overseas than it was to other states of Australia, so it's amazing to think of the things that have changed in a COVID environment over the last couple of years. But certainly great to be here live, and great to see so many faces engaged in the space that we love so much. I might start a bit off script, just responding to some of the things I've heard so far. I think people see the forestry investment space or even the landscape investment space as a specialty asset class. I've spent a lifetime in infrastructure investment, and having spent the last 6 years in forestry, I can say they're almost exactly the same. So I would like to debunk that forestry is different, and very different, and so different that your allocations need to be different to play in the space. Probably 80% of what I see in the forestry asset class, from the structuring to the tax to the treatments to all of those sorts of things, are exactly the same as real estate and infrastructure. The specialty skills that you need managing a forest, the silviculture components, etc., are no different to a specialist airport management team that is required to manage a complex environment like an airport. And so for us, every time we hear that forestry is a specialty class or is different or needs special, well, that word's always mentioned. It's special for a whole bunch of reasons, not because you shouldn't invest in it. It's very similar for a whole bunch of reasons to the other asset classes, and different in, I suspect, very special ways: non-correlated, inflation protected, and very differentiated from other core commodity markets, because ultimately forestry ends up in a commodity trade with the fibre. I think the second thing I heard today was that it was difficult to combine carbon outcomes with commercial forestry. That's not the case at all. In fact, we have sold over $250 million of carbon credits, forestry carbon credits, into the US Californian carbon market. A lot of those from commercial forests, and same in New Zealand and the same in Australia. In fact, you could convert a short rotation harvest in hardwood in Australia to a long rotation harvest in softwood, where Australia is suffering a significant deficit of wood supply, and make significant carbon contribution, fully commercial. So you could cut down every tree, and just that switch between short rotation and long rotation would give you a great carbon outcome. So let's make sure that we understand what we're trying to do here, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the complexities and confusions that are causing some of this. But just some background on New Forest. We're an asset management business, a funds management business, established 17 years ago in Sydney, Australia. We now have 90 employees around the world. So we have offices in Singapore, in San Francisco, in Mount Wanganui in New Zealand. We've just opened an office in Nairobi in Kenya as well. So not quite a truly global player, but that is certainly our vision, to become a truly global landscape management player. So a couple of geographies to plug there, but we're now the second biggest TIMO, I guess is the traditional term, in the world. And so our growth profile has been quite significant over the last 10 years, particularly. $6 billion under management US dollars, but actually more importantly, 1.2 million hectares. And I'll talk about why land and land access is critical to the outcomes that we produce over the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. And I think in a shortish presentation like this, Warren's given me leeway not to answer questions, but I'm sure we'll try and get to that at the end of this presentation if we can. I think part of what's made New Forest special, and I know a lot in the room, other TIMOs, etc., may also argue the point, which is great, is that we've always had sustainability at the core of our DNA. And so you'll see three themes there at the bottom of what we're trying to achieve at the moment. And so forests and natural forests as a part of the climate solution. We absolutely and fundamentally believe that's what's going to happen. The contribution the landscape will make to that is very significant, and I'll get to some numbers in a sec. I'll talk a lot about it today because we can tend to focus on carbon, but actually the focus on a circular bioeconomy is really critical to a sustainable future, not just a decarbonised future. And obviously wood fibre, if you look around this room, pretty much everything in this room could be built or made with wood fibre. The shirt I'm wearing, the plastic in this clicker, the chairs and tables, the furniture, the carpets, the fabrics, everything that you see in this room can actually be made out of wood fibre. So sustainable plantation forestry. So we want to see the back end of petrochemical plastics, the steel and concrete that sits in the walls. Anything that is difficult to manage in terms of sustainability, wood fibre can reproduce, and that's really exciting. Now you've just lost my prezzo there. I can ad-lib, but it might be a little bit more chaotic. So just some numbers. The landscape piece at the moment is obviously a net contributor to the carbon problem. So across mostly agriculture, but certainly in our space as well, we're not wholly focused on our net contributions. And so you can see here that 25% of the contribution to the overall carbon problem comes from the landscape. And so at least that part of the solution must come from the landscape, if not more. And we certainly believe a significant additional component can come from the landscape to offset other parts of the economy, including more significantly, the energy space. All the modelling, I hope I'm preaching to the converted here, but all the modelling indicates that to keep under the 2 degrees, we have to eliminate deforestation, so protect what's there. The global forestry estate, whether it's conservation, productive or otherwise, needs to stop shrinking. You know, we've had hundreds of years of deforestation across the globe, and when we think about the best way to fix the planet, it's to stop that and reforest the planet and restore that ecological balance. What does that mean? Well, it's hundreds of millions of hectares of reforestation. Hundreds of millions of hectares of reforestation. Removals, to achieve net zero, there's no doubt that removals are going to be a critical part of this. So if you want to call it offsetting, you can call it removals, whatever it will be. We will have a significant challenge in decarbonising supply chains, so stopping the production of the carbon through the supply chains of everything that we consume as humans on this planet. But actually what we need in addition to that to achieve our targets is removals. And obviously some industries will struggle to have decarbonisation. We think about the aviation sector as a good example of that. It's simple to say stop flying. It's also very difficult to see a net zero decarbonised aviation industry for a long time yet. So offsets should and will play a significant contribution to achieving these targets in the medium term, whilst those industries adjust and take their time to decarbonise in an efficient and economic way. And I think that provides exciting opportunities across the landscape. So natural climate solutions, there's a bit of nomenclature around all of this, the words that are thrown around, but we tend to focus on natural climate solutions as the basket of things, including decarbonisation, offsetting and nature positive. And I'll talk a lot about nature positive today because I'm sure there'll be a lot of focus on carbon otherwise. 10 billion tonnes of CO2 emission reductions and removals from land use. So that's its contribution at the moment, and that's the contribution we have to stop just to get to a base of net zero forward production from the land use sector. So it's 25% of the problem just across the landscape sector. We need to keep, you'll see across the bottom there the actions we need to take. We need to stop the deforestation, but we need to manage every hectare that we have under productive estate much better. So we talk in agricultural senses of getting 1% to 2% yield increases across crops. Corn in the USA is a good example of that. It's well tracked, and there's great documentation about how we can get more corn out of every corn stalk, out of every hectare or acre over there that we produce. So how do we make our land more productive and produce more biomass? And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to circular economy. And then, of course, the critical piece, we need to restore. So a lot of damage has been done, and the landscape can help us recover that and restore it, removing the impact, removing the footprint that we've had on the planet over the last thousands of years. And what's needed to do that? Well, the good news is hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is not a net cost, this is an investment opportunity as we transition the economy into a net positive in both a carbon space and also a nature positive space. And we have, fortunately, a large number of institutional clients with, as it mattered, trillions of dollars to spend. And so if we can sell this to them as an investment opportunity, we only need a small portion of that money that will be flowing through the economy in the next 30 years into this space to create this outcome. So it's a very exciting thing for us, and I want to talk a little bit at the back end of this about how we might achieve that and what some of the challenges are. So a little bit of focus on carbon pricing. What happens when the carbon price goes up across the landscape? And you'll see here a very rough and ready diagram that shows you how it shifts. It will pervert markets, and I don't use that word necessarily in a bad way. It will change things. It is a distortion in an existing market capacity, and it will make things move around. So at its highest level, when carbon gets to extremes, if you want to put it that way, we will stop using the landscape, and it will recover. And we will bank that recovery and it will solve the problem. But actually what happens when you distort it too far is we lose the other advantage the landscape provides, which is sustenance for people through food and wood fibre through the ultimate renewable resource. And in Australia we've tagged it exactly that. Wood fibre is the ultimate renewable resource. It can do everything around you. They can even use it in manufacture of electronic components now. So cellulosic technologies are extraordinary things, and we're going to bring those to bear over the next 30 years. But you can see the range of things that occur as you shift the carbon price here, and I think there has to be a balance in all of this. There's obviously an urgency at the moment to solve the carbon problem, but we need that focus to shift also into the nature positive space. And I'll talk a little bit about monocultures as well in the plantation space and what advantages and disadvantages they might have. So when we talk about the solution, actually it's focused around land. What you do on top of the land is optional, you know, and additional. So once you have the underlying land, you can make choices about what you do with it, which is the exciting thing for us. We can plant trees, we can revert it to agriculture, we can restore it to conservation, we can dig it up. So there's no limit to what you can do once you own a piece of land. And it was great to hear the question about First Nations people, Indigenous tribes, etc. They control and manage and operate on enormous tracts of land. And so engaging in that part of the sector, bringing that capacity and capability up and introducing that land into some of these solutions is going to be a big part of the solutions here. And we work with First Nations people in the US, Maori tribes in New Zealand, Indigenous people in Australia to try and couple this together across land tracts that they control and own, and in some instances want to get control back on. So providing an economic impetus to bring that land back into First Nations hands. So really satisfying outcome, but deriving all of the economic and environmental outcomes that can also come with that. So again, additionality. So we need to bring millions of smallholders of land together. Most of those millions of smallholders of land are farmers. Coming into the forestry sector 7 years ago, the great distress to me was that farmers and foresters don't get on. So never understood that. Foresters are effectively farmers, long rotation crop on a piece of agricultural land. Farmers don't see it that way, traditional farmers don't see it that way. And part of what New Forest wants to do is bring the landscape together so that farmers become foresters and foresters are seen as farmers and they work in tandem. The complexity of transforming global supply chains is also going to be critical to this. It's not a simple matter of simply planting more trees. The decarbonisation piece needs to sit alongside that. New Forest has done a lot in demand-side integrity. And so from our perspective, making sure we're selling offsets where we are to decent people who are otherwise decarbonising, rather than selling offsets to people who are not decarbonising and just using offsets. That's one example of where this space needs to move. And so demand-side integrity, as well as this important supply-side integrity piece, need to come together and make sure everyone is doing everything that they can, not just buying offsets to remove their sins. And that will have a significant impact on carbon as an asset. So that's a really exciting opportunity here. Trillions of dollars of money will sit in carbon assets over the next 30 years. I have no doubt of that. And New Forest believes that asset can be fungible, liquid, tradable, and balance sheetable. So if you want to keep them and you want to claim them and you want to sell them, you can do whatever you want with them. It's just another commodity, which is a really exciting opportunity. And the big advantage we have across landscapes is its very long-term horizons. I think, as you all know, no one should get involved in agriculture for a 5-year play. Agriculture is a 30-year play. Forestry also sits well in that space. Trees grow for somewhere between, well, depending on where you are, 8 years in Vietnam maybe to 80 years in the US West. So the investment thesis around forestry sits naturally with long-term investors. And so making sure we get those structures right and the right incentives involved in those structures to ensure that people are playing the space right and not necessarily for the short-term gains that investors are sometimes looking for is really critical to match the right investors to this investment space. So how is the investment strategy space evolving in forestry? It's not really. It's still fundamentally about forestry, and we would love to see it stay about forestry and trees and products. So wood fibre is a store of carbon, and I think it was mentioned before in the previous panel that getting the recognition of where that wood is stored, and you can see it all around this room, and how long it's stored and where it's stored, and the credibility of those scientific observations is really critical to ensuring we capture the whole value chain in where carbon and wood fibre come together. And so for us, it's making sure we see new plantation establishment, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec, but also recognising the current contribution the space makes to decarbonisation, and certainly the embodied carbon piece is under-recognised at this point in time. The circular bioeconomy is going to be critical to that sustainable future, and I'll give you a couple of live examples that we have in our business at the moment. So what's needed to make that investment thesis work? From our perspective, can't say it clearly enough, methodologies. We need credible, science-backed methodologies about what we're doing. So that additionality piece that was mentioned in the last panel is really critical. How do we achieve it? How do we know it stays there? How do we know it's banked for 100 years to ensure that what we're selling is a credible product that has a backed life and can be resold time and time again over its lifetime? And so those methodologies that set the baseline, prove out the additionality and then create the market are really critical. Carbon has taken a long time to get to a point where those methodologies are accepted. We still have, mostly through varied differentiated geographic markets, the US Western Climate Initiative through the Californian Carbon Market, the New Zealand Credit Unit Carbon Trading Scheme in New Zealand, the Emissions Reduction Fund in Australia. I mean, I could go on, there's a list of these things where people have developed these things like mushrooms in the corner. And the coordination of those schemes, the coordination of the methodologies, the science behind these things has been relatively poor. And I think a lot of you in this room have worked hard to bring those things together. The carbon problem is a global problem. So from our perspective, having a single tradable global carbon unit is critical to the solution of this as well, and the credibility of the markets. And then what you achieve overall is both an investment outcome, and how that's measured can be many and varied other than just economic, but also more importantly, hopefully, balance sheeting impact and climate and sustainability and environment and social and governance outcome. And making sure that triple bottom line that was spoken about 30 years ago and that accountants have juggled badly like a circus clown over that time and that period, bringing those to bear onto balance sheets so that they're recognised and that the dividend isn't the only thing we focus on is going to be really critical. So looking forward to doing that. I'd point you to foraco.com.au. We released a carbon natural capital account in that business, which we believe is one of the world's first independently verified by KPMG natural capital accounts across a conservation estate that we have in Tasmania in Australia. Forgive us, it's a rough start. It's not where it's going to end up, but if we don't start somewhere, we're never going to have a source of truth for that baseline or a source of understanding about where the markets are going to emerge. We're waiting now for companies to come forward. The big companies of the world, I've got an Apple phone in front of me here, to come and tell us what their impact is and tell us what they need to be offset so that they can go to market with a carbon neutral and a nature neutral phone, or even a carbon positive phone and a nature positive phone. Tell us where the damage is and we'll tell you where the benefit is in the estates that we manage and the land we manage. And when we combine a willing buyer and a willing seller in that market, particularly in the nature positive space, landscapes are going to change dramatically, and it's a very exciting opportunity. Couple of quick ones here. I mean, where have we come from? Standardised accounting sounds simple. It's not. It's not been. It's been part of the problem, and where we need to get to here is a comprehensive and standardised and transparent system that everyone believes in. We don't need different systems in different states in Australia, let alone the world. That happens in Australia. You'll have a different state with a different system to another state in a single country. So that standardisation and transparency so that we can report against what we're saying, back it up with science-based targets and prove what we're doing, shouldn't be that hard. So hopefully the world can move to a space where we do that. So just a couple of minutes on the circular bioeconomy here. There's obviously not enough trees to do what I said, which is replace everything in this room with wood fibre, sadly. We would love that to be the case. But when you look in that middle box of outputs there about what wood fibre can do, there's no doubt that the burgeoning market for additional wood products at a higher value to the current supply chain is going to provide significant impetus for foresters to buy more land, which is the underlying challenge to the forestry industry at the moment in establishing new plantations and therefore increasing the level of wood fibre that's produced. And also bioenergy. You know, at the moment we see a significant proportion of the biomass rotting on the forest floor. There's got to be a better way to manage that. There's got to be a better way to offset that in the context of other ways that we produce energy, which is still quite distressing to think we dig up billion-year-old coal and burn it in a furnace while forestry residues are rotting on the forest floor. I mean, the nonsense around it is quite apparent, and I'm sure they'll laugh at us in 50 to 100 years. But when you think about it, sustainable packaging, everything we have comes in a packet. Cellulosic fibres that can make electronic components and provide chemicals into pharmaceuticals and into biofuels. Natural engineered wood products. Extraordinary to think now that you can build a 20-storey building purely out of wood, not a single piece of steel or concrete in a 20-storey building. And that's only going to get better. And biomass and energy. Absolutely really critical to see the energy sector transform. And I know, and again, in 100 years they'll look back and wonder why we didn't take the free energy that was coming from the sun and use it in a better way. So when we talk about nature positive, just to give a context to this, we need to do a lot better. The carbon issue has taken too long to get into frame. The methodologies there took a long time to develop, and I know a lot of people worked very hard on that. So it's not a criticism, but it's about the urgency of the solution that's needed. And if we have to go through this entire process here outlined like we did in the carbon space on the nature positive space, then a lot more of the planet's going to suffer before we solve the problem, and probably unnecessarily so. And so that journey on nature positive needs to be a lot quicker than what the carbon journey has been. And we'd certainly encourage everyone to get together and get those methodologies and that science backed as soon as possible to try and ensure that we can establish that credible underlying product that can offset the impact that companies are having. As they try and reduce that impact and eliminate that impact, we'll also have offsetting in the nature space as well. And so we'll need clear strategies, quality data and accounting systems. We need to avoid double counting, and the credibility of the system is absolutely essential to ensuring that we have that nature positive piece come very quickly to where carbon has got to over the last 10 years. So a couple of quick examples. We own a sawmilling business, very traditional sawmilling business in Australia called Timber. Some quite interesting things at the very front end of higher-end engineered wood products. So cross-laminated timber and glue-laminated timber are the foundation of multi-storey buildings in the wood space. These are the things that are producing 20-storey buildings in wood and allow us to move away from steel and concrete. So it's exciting in Australia that we're investing $20–25 million in a new plant that's going to be able to provide that structural timber into the Australian domestic multi-storey commercial and residential building space. But on the other side, we're also embodying plastic. So petrochemical plastic, otherwise released to landfill, is now being captured by our milling business, extruded into a combined wood product and built into a deck. Now that decking life, like any wood product, would potentially have up to 100 years. But the advantage of that wood product and the way it's extruded is once you've got to end of life, you can take the fibres in that, both the plastic and the wooden fibres in that, and reconstruct it. So you reconstitute it and make a brand new deck in 100 years, if they're still building decks in 100 years, I guess. So very exciting opportunities for us as we combine processing and value add to the underlying land and tree assets. That's been an interesting challenge with our investors. A lot of our investors come into the space thinking they're buying land and trees. They bought this mill, and this mill is now worth well over a third of the entire portfolio that it sits in, where it previously was about 5% of the value. Because of the value add we're trying to create. The essential thing about value add is once we get a higher value for fibre, we can plant more trees where trees previously weren't. So it becomes less a game of trading brownfields trees between institutional investors and more a game about buying agricultural land back and planting more trees, or getting farmers to plant the back paddock up with trees instead of leaving it fallow or under-resource. So in Australia, I'll give you a landscape example. In Australia, we have 400 million, this is rounding for effect, so the numbers aren't quite right, but 400 million hectares of agricultural land and 2 million hectares of plantation forestry. So 0.5% of the productive land is in forestry, 0.5%. And we have a wood deficit in Australia. Now, why is that? Well, farmers get more for what they sell than what we sell. And so we can't afford the land values to convert some of that land back to wood fibre. 10% of that farming land is not used. So every farm has a back paddock, has an underperforming fallow piece of land, has saline influence on its land where the crops aren't doing well. 10% of that land is not used. It's 40 million hectares. 2 million hectares of plantation land in Australia. 40 million hectares of agricultural land not used, not productive. So to connect the dots here and make the change, isn't that a simple leap of faith? We suspect it is. So we've got to connect the landscape to each other. It's not a matter of having a wheat farm over there and a pine plantation over there. You can have a pine plantation in the middle of a wheat farm. And New Forest vision is that we're going to make that happen. And it's a very exciting challenge for us. So the growth opportunities we see, there's no doubt that wood fibre should be planted in the tropics and the subtropics. That's where trees grow well. And so the critical question there is how do you get access to land in those areas, and how do you connect to the social licence in those areas where most of it is agricultural land and in many instances for subsistence farming. It's going to be a very interesting challenge, but we have no doubt that that is where most of the impact will come if we can plant trees in those regions. Very exciting. We need carbon forestry investment, so combining the underlying thesis of core land and trees with the carbon overlay, and you can do both. You can do both, and we're doing both. Making sure we get productive forests that also have carbon additionality, and combining those things together will absolutely give you better access to land because you're able to pay more in an optimised landscape. And that's really exciting for us to see that integrated landscape come together, which is the last point there. Integrating agriculture, forestry, carbon and nature into every single hectare that we manage, we're going to make that happen. It has to be the focus of everyone who has control over a piece of land to optimise the outcome. It's no good to say anymore that, you know, the state in the US that grows corn must grow corn. And that's always been the way, and that's always the way it should be, because supply chains are fixed and this can't move and this can't change. It's nonsense. Every piece of land deserves that challenge. What can we do best on that hectare? And I can guarantee that that will bring significant change across the landscape. Oh, there we go. So from our perspective, New Forests want to see this happen now. The time is now. We're obviously acutely aware of the carbon issue and the carbon challenge, but it's also exactly the case, if not worse, on the nature positive side. Extraordinary amount of extinctions still happening across the planet. Landscapes managed very poorly. Even in Australia 3 years ago, we had you might have seen on the news, extraordinary fires that burnt out 6.5 million hectares of effectively native conservation estate. 85% of the biomass perished in those fires across 6.5 million hectares of landscape. Now that's because that landscape is left badly managed by our government. It's a conservation area and the fuel burn up and everything was very poorly managed. If we'd had someone who could go into that landscape and accentuate it, remove the fuel, manage for biodiversity, manage for that conservation, not for productive wood fibre, then the outcome of that fire would have been far better and the value of that land as a conservation estate would have been far higher. And we're just not having those signals sent to the market at the moment. We also believe that it's very clear on what we need to succeed. So again, common methodologies, common science and common markets. We don't need to be different. We don't need to differentiate on that side of it. That is not a special part of what's going to happen here. In fact, exactly the opposite. If we're going to spend 10 years arguing about methodologies and credibility of methodologies, pack up and go home. We need to get the science in front of everyone and justify what we're doing and show exactly what the positive impact is against offsetting the negative impact. It's an exciting challenge, and certainly there's a lot of names in this room. I'm looking at Sarah there. We're going to be moving around the room today, capturing all the wonderful scientists who are in here and trying to understand what they're doing and what they're bringing to the space, because we want to give them a loud voice and make it happen. We're foresters, not necessarily scientists, and we want to connect that community to our space and the regulators and make it happen. So we'll need cooperation, coordination and focus. We're a bit patchy on that at a global level, so we need to work harder to make sure that we can forge that path. And we don't doubt at New Forest that we can transform the world into a sustainable bioeconomy using landscape management. So better farming, better forestry, more conservation and better outcome. So it's an exciting challenge and we look forward to working with all of you over that time. I might leave it there, Warren. I can't see Q&A, no questions yet. That's a bloody good sign. But happy to take a couple of questions from the floor until I get cut off.
What's the interaction between New Forest and the rest of the world? Is it just through your assets, or is it with, how does that happen?
It happens in both forums. So New Forest is more focused on the top level conversations. So when we sit down with Amazon and Apple and they come to us with propositions and we tell them that's not a good idea and we proposition something different and we try and have that conversation with them. Actually, interestingly enough, when we talk to some of the big corporates who are trying to reach these spaces, so nature positive, carbon positive, they actually start out with an investment thesis. I want to invest in forestry, I want a 12% return. And we say, well, do you? Or do you want a nature positive, carbon positive phone? And I'll sort that bit out. So we actually try and reconstitute the conversation to say, what are you trying to achieve here? Apple has hundreds of billions of dollars sitting in its bank. Is it best set in a farm or a forestry estate? Or is it best set focus on decarbonising its supply chain and putting that money in there? And we'll bring those other benefits to you at a much lower cost of capital and a much faster and more accelerated outcome. So that effectiveness and efficiency piece is what New Forest is focused at. Then down at asset level, it's all about outcomes. So at a quite micro level, and I'll give you one example, I didn't mention it in the thing and I said I would, but monocultures. So in Australia, we have a large eucalyptus nitens plantation in Victoria, Australia. We also have a disturbing koala problem in Australia, in some parts of Australia, where koalas are very highly valued domestic species in Australia, endangered in some parts. In our plantation estate, we have 40,000 koalas. Now in that monoculture, there are 40,000 koalas that wouldn't be there otherwise. So if we converted that land back to the wheat belt that it sits in, and it sat as agricultural property, those koalas wouldn't move, they would starve and die. There would be 40,000 less koalas around. And so when we think about some of these values, we're asking the assets to find these values and find these nuances in the landscape that we can bring to bear, bring to market and understand better. And so that koala example, in a time where we're desperately needing of more koalas, and when I talk about those fires, some of the pictures you might have seen over there were of melting koalas. It was horrible. And so for us to be able to say our plantation estate contains 40,000 koalas that otherwise wouldn't exist, who cares? Well, we want to find people who care. And potentially we want to find people who buy that value. And that's the connection that we're trying to make. So at asset level, quite specific. At New Forest level, talking about efficiently and effectively decarbonising the planet and setting nature for a positive return and having the conversations with the scientists and the regulators and making that happen. And of course, most critically at all, of course, I'm looking at Joost here, our investors, making sure we understand what they want and they understand what's possible. So that investor conversation is part of the reason we're in Europe this week and in the UK. We want to deepen that level of conversation and make sure everyone understands what they're talking about, including ourselves, because we're learning as well.
Thank you. I think we'll have one question before we'll go for the official networking break.
Hi, Mark. Rachel Nutter from Climate Impact Partners. You talked about the rising carbon price and the opportunities that presents. How do you think about a scenario where carbon plateaus or falls, perhaps relative to timber value, and how do you think about the permanence aspects of the carbon in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rachel. From our perspective, we bake in a conservative amount of the carbon outcome. So actually a question we got asked yesterday in an investor meeting was, why is the carbon so low in this model? Why is it only 1% of the returns? And we say, well, we don't think you need it, but it will be upside. And so part of the reason we treat it that way is because empirical data on carbon outcomes in New Zealand, for example, where we invest significant portions of money, are very short. So it's very hard to point to a stable, long-term underlying market. So what should you do as an investor when you see that sort of outcome? You should discount it significantly. So at the moment, that's where we play, and making sure that our investors understand that there is a core investment underneath that play that brings other diversified revenue streams into the business. So the land, capital appreciation, the fibre and the revenue stream that comes from fibre. All of these other things will play out as upside at this point in time. Would we love to see those more baked in and more certain? Absolutely. And so that's why I spent a lot of time today talking about credible markets, credible methodologies, and making sure people understand from a regulatory perspective that those things aren't going to change. So the Californian carbon market, the Western Climate Initiative, 2030 is the date. So what do I tell investors? Well, it's 2030, sadly. Would I like it 2050? Or, would that provide better certainty and a better way to bank that? Absolutely. So the simple answer is we're conservative, and we'd like not to be. So that would breed better pricing, better ability to access land, and therefore more forests, more outcome. So the more we can bake in, the better that we become. So it's sort of like a self-licking lollipop. Can I use that analogy? Yeah. Done. Thank you.
Great.